Think it's cold up in the Arctic in northern Russia? Well, it's become a real hot spot lately. Thing is, Russia and China have teamed up to develop the North Sea route, and they're doing major dredging work, pulling up millions of tons of soil from the bottom. They're also building a terminal that'll handle 100 million tons of one of today's most vital resources, oil. And yes, this port facility is part of a project worth a whopping $100 billion. It includes the building of villages, power stations, and all the other infrastructure that'll support the Arctic transport route. No internet? No problem. They're laying fiber optic cables stretching thousands of miles. Seems like no one in the Arctic remembers the cold anymore. It's a full-on infrastructure hotspot up there. But you know what else is heating things up in the traditionally chilly Arctic? The US and Canada clearly aren't thrilled at the trade routes developing, not on their side of the Arctic Ocean, but on the opposite one. On top of that, the new route could seriously shake up the Suez Canal. Time to figure out what's going on up in the Arctic part of our planet. The Northern Sea Route, or NSR, didn't just show up yesterday. It's been in active use for almost 100 years, since the mid-1930s. Still, it's not on the list of routes that play a big role in global trade. As of 2022, the total cargo volume along the NSR was just over 34 million tons. In 2023, a record high was hit. 36.2 million tons of cargo were moved. Sounds impressive? Well, that's only if you don't compare it to the main rival, the route that goes through the Suez Canal. Around 1.5 billion tons of cargo passed along that path between Asia and Europe and back in 2023. And that's during a time when the canal's facing some serious issues, which we'll get into a bit later. So yeah, the difference is huge. Why? Well, the most obvious reason is that the Northern Sea Route goes through the Arctic. Yeah, like we said, it's hot there now because of Russia and China doing all sorts of construction, but normally it's cold, and there's a lot of ice. So much ice, in fact, that some parts of the route are only ice-free for 2 months a year. Obviously, in a situation like that, the Suez Canal is the better option for cargo from the Asia-Pacific region, as there's never any ice there. Russia actually has a solution to this problem, icebreakers, which is why the country is rightly called an ice-breaking nation. As of early 2025, Russia had 34 diesel-electric icebreakers and 8 nuclear ones. No other country in the world has that many giants capable of plowing through ice. In fact, some of these icebreakers help cargo ships make their way through the Arctic ice of the Northern Sea Route. In that very record-breaking year of 2023, in terms of the number of ships passing through the NSR, Russia's nuclear icebreakers provided over 730 escort services. One striking example was the assistance given in September of that same year by the icebreakers Taimyr and Sibir, which carried out an operation to escort the Cape-size Gingo bulk carrier with 164,500 tons of iron ore concentrate. It took 13 days to help the cargo ship, but the mission was successfully completed. Yes, icebreakers can make the NSR navigable, but imagine if all of Russia's icebreakers had to spend every single day just guiding ships through the local Arctic ice. And even then, that'd be just barely enough to get anywhere close to the trade volumes of the Suez Canal. Though, honestly, that's still a stretch since the amount of cargo that would need to move along the Arctic route is just enormous. So yeah, the NSR is still more of a novelty when it comes to shipping stuff from the Asia-Pacific region to Europe. And here comes something you wouldn't really expect to help in all this: climate change. Researchers have realized that over the last 30 years, global temperatures have been rising, Arctic ice has been shrinking. This means that, although not anytime soon, the time will come when ships will be able to get through with less help from icebreakers. On top of that, the Northern Sea Route's a shorter path for certain countries. If, say, you needed to deliver goods from Tokyo to Hamburg, then the distance by NSR would be 8,000 miles, and through the Suez Canal, 12,400 miles. Quite a gap there. Meanwhile, the Suez Canal itself has recently started losing ground quite a bit, which has seriously boosted the prospects of the NSR. Surely many of you have heard this news, which seems to pop up almost every month. In the Red Sea, one ship gets attacked, then another, then a third. Add to that missiles, explosions, constant conflicts. In the end, for example, in 2024, just over 13,000 vessels passed through the canal, which is 50% less than in 2023, when more than 26,000 vessels went through. Many are already thinking about a similar route now, one where there's no risk of getting hit by a missile and facing billions in losses. That's exactly why Russia, together with China, has kicked off active development of the NSR. The countries want to shake up global sea trade and leave the troublesome Suez Canal out of the game. First off, let's look at this section of the Northern Sea Route, and to be more specific, at what's just a bit south of the route itself. That's the Bay of Ob, a place where the Russian port of Sabetta is located. How's it linked to the NSR? The port is a key part of the Yamal LNG gas project, which, by the way, gets investments from China National Petroleum Corporation and the China Silk Road Fund. And exactly in Sabetta, the Russian-Chinese gas ambitions connected with the NSR are coming alive. There, they load liquefied natural gas onto water transport, which then sails to its destination via the Northern Sea Route. By 2019, Sabetta's cargo turnover had already reached 19.5 million tons a year. Pretty good result. But in Russia, they figured the port could handle more, so the biggest dredging work in Russian history kicked off, the reconstruction of Bay of Ob Sea Channel. In 2020, 8 main vessels, self-propelled bilge dredgers, joined the effort along with 12 auxiliary vessels, including some from Belgium, Germany, and the Netherlands. Over 1,000 people handled the maintenance of all the machinery and ships. In the end, over 79 days, through the combined efforts, they lifted 1.1 billion cubic feet of soil from the bottom. And that was just the beginning, because the project's goal is huge: to adapt the existing shipping channel so that Yamal-Max-type ships can pass through it. This is a special class of tankers for carrying liquefied natural gas, and the vessels that meet this standard are giants of the seas, measuring 980 feet long with a dead weight of 80,000 tons. As the people in charge of the project say, by 2030, the canal will be able to handle up to 9 ship passages like this per day, which will seriously boost the port's cargo turnover. Naturally, this will also make the Northern Sea Route more attractive overall. Now let's move east. Here lies the northernmost settlement in Russia, called Dixon, a remote, hard-to-reach, isolated place that clearly isn't the kind of spot for some expensive construction project. But the Northern Sea Route needs to be developed, so 25 miles from this settlement, Russia is building an oil loading terminal called Buktyasever. Construction started in 2021. Ice-class ships delivered 20,000 tons of cargo to the site, including construction machinery, crew living quarters, communication equipment, and much more. All this was needed to carry out the plans for the first phase, building docks for unloading construction materials with a capacity of 0.88 million tons per year, performing coastal reinforcement works, building repair and mechanical workshops, storage areas for general cargo, and an overpass. The project is huge, and the conditions around aren't exactly great, so the work is still going on right now. For example, news from March 2025 says that the first phase of the project is already done, and the work has moved on to the next stage. Right now, they're building the first oil loading pier and getting ready to build the second one. They're also continuing with the logistics infrastructure and putting up hydraulic structures. At the same time, most of the work on building the 2 cargo piers is already finished. According to the plan, once construction's finished, Buktyasever will become Russia's biggest oil loading terminal with a storage park of 102 tanks. Right after the first phase is done, the terminal's oil throughput could hit 30 million tons a year. Then by 2030, they aim to reach a massive 100 million tons. Do you think this is just a port in some Arctic wasteland? Of course not. First, the oil has to come from somewhere, and second, everything has to be set up so it can work properly in a remote place with no real infrastructure. The Vostok oil project, with a massive price tag of over $100 billion, is going to make all that happen. As part of the project, oil fields are currently being developed, from which oil will eventually flow right to Buktyasever. To move the oil across all the Arctic wastelands, a pipeline about 248 miles long will be laid. Of course, all this requires electricity, so 13 power plants with a total capacity of 3.5 gigawatts and 4,350 miles of power lines will be built. To give you a sense of the project's scale, buried somewhere in thousands of pages of project documentation are also plans to build 15 towns and 2 airstrips. When will the project be finished? Judging by the scale and how tricky it is to pull off something like this, no one really knows. But it's worth saying that even if just the main part of the plan gets done and a terminal with a capacity of over 100 million tons of oil shows up, that would already be an incredible leap forward for the Northern Sea Route. Another huge project that'll boost the development of the NSR is the Polar Express, a trans-Arctic underwater communication cable planned to run from Murmansk to Vladivostok. It'll be 7,800 miles long, and to cut down on logistics costs, another project was launched, a cable factory in Murmansk, which is now busy making parts for the communication route along the Northern Sea Route. At this point in the video, the United Arab Emirates show up, namely the global port operator DP World. In 2021, they made a pact with Russia's nuclear giant Rosatom to develop the Northern Sea Route. Among several things, there was the revamp of the port in Vladivostok, found at the eastern edge of the NSR. As part of this upgrade, the port infrastructure will need to be able to handle trains and feeder ships from China and other places, then move them onto huge container ships heading to Europe. The other end of the route, the port in Murmansk, is also part of the Russia-UAE cooperation. They plan to make it an equally important and efficient transshipment point. Alongside the UAE, China is also stepping up big time in the development of the Northern Sea Route. What's more, China is Russia's key partner in this area. To understand how important the Northern Route is for China, it's worth saying that back in 2017, the country announced the creation of the Polar Silk Road, which adds to the massive Belt and Road Initiative project, and the Polar Silk Road is basically the same as Russia's Northern Sea Route. In short, developing Russian ports was essential here, so there were tons of bilateral agreements with Chinese companies investing in all kinds of projects tied to the Northern Route. We've already talked about Yamal LNG, where Chinese money went. Also, back in 2018, China started investing in the port of Arkhangelsk, which isn't a deep water port, as it doesn't have enough depth to handle large ships. As a result, a Chinese company decided to put money into building a new terminal that could take ships with a dead weight of up to 75,000 tons, which means more dredging work will be needed. Clearly, this will turn Arkhangelsk into another trade hub, boosting the appeal of the Northern Sea Route. The Chinese have also invested in building a 500-mile railway that'll stretch from the new port to Siberia. All the places with train stations along the way will benefit from it. The NSR, of course, will be among the winners too, as it'll be directly linked to Siberia. Besides that, Chinese investments have come into a bunch of other port and infrastructure projects. To put it simply, China is actively pouring money into developing the Northern Sea Route and, of course, into its latest Belt and Road Initiative project. All of these projects and investments, according to Russia, should lead to the Northern Sea Route handling over 220 million tons of cargo by 2035. Let's remember that in 2023, 36 million tons of cargo were moved via the NSR. That means in 12 years, Russia plans to increase that figure more than sixfold. A pretty ambitious goal. However, there's growing doubt now that the country will actually pull it off. The Arctic's thawing, which means that in the future there will be less need for help from icebreakers, and the risk of any cost related to moving through ice will also go down. By the way, this is one of the main reasons why many people choose the Suez Canal. Besides that, the NSR is simply a shorter route for many countries, which also helps cut costs. From China to Europe, a ship takes 19 days via the northern route and 48 days via the southern one. Of course, we can't forget that there are no pirates or attacks on merchant ships up there in the Arctic. That's a big plus as well. And soon enough, the infrastructure that Russia and its partners are currently building will be another reason why companies and entire countries will probably choose the Northern Sea Route over the Suez Canal. However, there's one but, or rather two, which are located on the other side of the Arctic Ocean from the Northern Sea Route. Yep, the US and Canada. These countries have a similar Northwest Passage that can just as well make trade way easier. But while Russia has dozens of icebreakers already clearing the way through the ice for tens of thousands of tons of cargo, their neighbors across the Arctic Ocean have a problem with that. In the US, heavy icebreakers haven't been designed or built since the 1970s, and the related skills, let's just say, have been lost. Right now, the U.S. has the Polar Star icebreaker, which is 49 years old, plus the medium icebreakers Healy and Storis, with the latter only set to start working next year. Yes, back in 2019, the U.S. signed a contract with a shipyard in Mississippi to build a 23,000-ton heavy icebreaker called the Polar Security Cutter, but the country currently has huge problems with shipbuilding capacity. For example, the whole Polar Security Cutter program has gone over budget by 60% on top of $5.1 billion. In Canada, the situation's a bit better. Right now, they have 9 icebreakers, plus there are 2 heavy polar icebreakers being built in Vancouver and Quebec, and they're set to be up and running in the early 2030s. Even if both the US and Canada put all their efforts into opening up the Northwest Arctic route for trade ships, they still won't have enough capacity to keep up with Russia and its partners, and that's a big miss, especially as rivals are boosting their influence in global trade. Also, you can't ignore the current hot topic of the China-US rivalry here. China's involvement in any projects related to the Arctic is already a threat to the States. Besides, for China, taking part in developing the NSR isn't even their first move towards the Arctic zone. For example, China has 2 research stations, one on the Norwegian archipelago of Svalbard and another in Iceland. In 2016, China even tried to get a foothold in Greenland. The country came forward with a generous offer to build satellite ground and research stations. They also offered to fix up the island's airports and expand mining exploration. On top of that, China showed interest in buying an old military base in Greenland. Washington immediately understood where this was heading, got in touch with Denmark, which handles Greenland's foreign and defense policy, and as a result, China's proposals were turned down. That's a good outcome for the U.S., but they'll always have to stay alert. Their main global rival is doing everything it can to get into the Arctic, and that, as always, is a military and economic threat to the states. Despite all the complaints from neighbors around the Arctic Ocean, Russia, together with its partners from China, keeps pushing forward with its Arctic route. Where will this lead? It'll definitely become a serious competitor to the Suez Canal, but everything else is too tied up with geopolitics, something you can never be 100% sure about.